Hi, welcome to this part of my multi-part review of Vampire the Masquerade 20th Anniversary Edition core rulebook. This time I'm going to talk about two disciplines, one of them somewhat more simple when compared to the other, which is Fortitude, but also Necromancy. Necromancy is deep and complex, both lore-wise and mechanically speaking in Vampire the Masquerade. So let's get into it. First, let's talk about Fortitude. Fortitude, it's basically an unnatural constitution, something that makes it a lot harder for a vampire to get hurt through a number of attacks. It could be somewhat a more conventional source of damage, like using knives and swords and bullets, blunt attacks, etc. But it could also serve as a means of protection against supernatural attacks, those things that are a bit more on the magical side, or fire-based attacks, silver, etc. Or even sunlight. So this is a big difference because normally vampires are more resistant, a bit more sturdy when compared to normal humans. If a vampire takes a bullet to the head, there's a good chance of surviving that when compared to a human. A human will most likely end up dead after such an attack. But a vampire with Fortitude, he is even more resistant. He has a significant better chance at coming out unscathed from that. And how does this work? Well, you basically make a soak roll, and we will talk about that later on when I talk about the system in another part of this multi-part review. And that soak roll is benefited from your Fortitude, from your points invested in Fortitude. However, if you take damage from, for example, the fangs of a supernatural creature such as a vampire or a werewolf claws, for example, or perhaps the claws from the Protean discipline, then you can only use Fortitude to try to soak that damage. Nonetheless, this is a very useful discipline, both for those vampires that are constantly in combat, or those that want to stay out of combat. And why is that? Well, for example, the Ventru. The Ventru are most of the time leaders or masterminds of different vampire operations. They are usually the targets of assassination attempts, so with Fortitude, they can manage to survive. On the other hand, for example, the Gangrel, that are usually on the roles of shock troops, they can find Fortitude quite useful because they usually end up in close combat type of situations, or even during a gunfight, or if there is an explosion nearby, Fortitude could save their undead hides. At higher levels of Fortitude, you can accomplish some really extraordinary things, because for example, you could develop a sort of like a personal armor to the point that when you get hit, perhaps you get cut with a sword or with a club, you get hit with a club, the weapon could break. Even though it damages you, the weapon breaks down. And for example, you could also share your natural Fortitude with some of your allies as well. Or you could develop an even stronger version of the personal armor, which is adamantine. And this breaks the weapon used against you, but you take no damage from it. So Fortitude is a very useful discipline, whether you are constantly fighting or if you're the target of assassination attempts, as I was saying. And this is a very useful discipline to have. Now let's talk about Necromancy. Necromancy is a discipline of great fluctuations and transitions throughout the history of Vampire the Masquerade, because with the whole thing of the Giovanni taking over, replacing the Cappadocians and some other bloodlines disappearing or falling a bit into obscurity, Necromancy has become a bit of a much sought after discipline, but it's still quite grotesque and dangerous. This is in fact one of the disciplines that keeps the Giovanni from falling out of grace with other vampire clans. Some vampire clans may not like the Giovanni too much, but when it comes to dealing with the dead and the spirits from the other side, they always turn to the Giovanni, and they may provide some help through Necromancy for a price. Similarly to the Thaumaturgy, Necromancy has several paths and some rituals. The different paths have to do with different areas representing the veil between the land of the living and the unliving. And when it comes to the rituals, They take a bit more time, sometimes a few minutes, sometimes hours, and they require great sacrifices, but when they are carried out successfully, the results are more powerful or more on the long-term side of things. Let's talk about some of these paths, although you have to invest points in each path, so necromancy is not exactly an easy to afford investment when you are developing your character. First we have the sepulchre path. So here you can witness, summon and command the spirits of the dead. You can see the spirits of the dead and even summon them, sometimes compelling a particular soul to an object or place. You can create hauntings and you can even torment spirits. So this is very useful, for example, if a vampire has gotten into trouble with a spirit or a wraith, this may be one of the only ways in which a necromancer can actually help that vampire to rid himself from that problem, because when vampires interact with those spirits, even though a vampire is a supernatural creature, it is very difficult to touch that wraith or spirit from the other side. You can usually do it through disciplines and perhaps magical or occult means and some aggravated damage sources, but for the most part it's very difficult for a vampire to interact with a wraith, and while the wraith torments the vampire in different ways, the vampire could feel a bit helpless. So this particular path of necromancy could be one of the only ways in which a vampire can obtain some sort of self-defense against the beings from the other side. Then we have the ash path, and this allows you to peer into the lands of the dead and even affect some things there. So that's a way in which you can perceive what goes on in the other side. You could find some clues or hidden information concerning someone who has already died or things that have happened. So you could communicate with those entities. You could even physically enter the underworld, kind of like Constantine. And you can also obtain such mastery over the shroud that you can even deny the passage or the means for other ghosts and wraiths to contact the material world. Then we have the bone path. This is all about moving corpses and manipulating dead souls, restoring them to the living world temporarily or otherwise. So this plays a bit with the stereotype or even archetype of the vampire lord moving his zombie minions. The lesser manifestations of the bone path are manipulating a body for a short time, for a few seconds, and carrying out some simple actions, but then you could have some undead minions that could actually attack your enemies. And you could even create vessels, that is, you could take a body, a living body, and remove the spirit from it, and take another spirit or wraith and put it inside that body as sort of like demonic possession of sorts. So if there's a particular wraith that is serving you, this could be a somewhat easy way to create an instantaneous servant. Then we have the cenotaph path. This is all about discovering and forging links between the living world and the Shadowlands, and sensing such links. So through this path, the vampire can actually tell if a wraith or a spirit of the other side has gone through a certain area or made contact with a certain object. You could even forge links between the wraiths and objects and people and places. And you could also see if someone has died and actually became a ghost. And you could also detect areas where there is a bit of a tear or a fragile spot between the world of the living and the dead. It's important to note that there are many paths in necromancy, but not all of them are easily available. Some of these paths belong to, as I was saying, bloodlines that have disappeared or have gone into obscurity, such as the Cappadocians, but there are also the Lamia and the Nagarraja. So it's not easy to get your hands into these paths, but with the right drive and perhaps connections, you can get your hands on the books or the tutoring needed to understand these lost paths. Then we have the path of the corpse in the monster. This is all about understanding the undead condition, but also how to use the corpse as an experience, as a gateway between life and death. So through this you could gain the appearance of being dead, that is like a corpse, not just a vampire. You could also negate some things that afflict vampires by becoming more corpse-like. So that way you would not be affected by, for example, sunlight or holy artifacts. Or you could even put a curse over a vampire to make that vampire temporarily vulnerable to mortal afflictions. You could even give the gift of life. So you could experience the best and most positive things about being alive, that is feeling hunger for food rather than blood, and enjoying sex and such. But of course these are the major manifestations of the path and not readily available to anyone. And then we have the grape's decay. And this path focuses on observing how time affects all things mortal, and playing around with these effects, using them for your convenience depending on the type of action that you want to carry out. Because, for example, maybe your vampire has just finished feeding upon a victim and now you need to get rid of the corpse. You can destroy the husk, which basically turns the body into dust. Or you could actually paralyze someone through rigor mortis. Or you can even cause a particular limb to wither. Or you could even destroy the body of a vampire. So it has to do with all of those effects of accelerating time. Then you have the path of the four humors. This is a very philosophical sort of path. It's basically understanding the interactions and interplay of the four philosophical humors, that is phlegm, blood, black bile, and yellow bile. So you can affect others emotionally and physically. You could do something to modify the mindset and the emotions of your target, but you could also turn the humors of your own body into perhaps a sort of poison, something that causes damage, something that makes someone become lethargic. In the case if you, for example, you're using phlegm, or perhaps you're using yellow bile, you could cause someone to become melancholic. You could even drink the blood from a corpse that has been dead for about 24 hours, that is somewhat not fresh, and you could turn into a sort of like a corpse being that is more resistant to damage and is able to sense death more easily. But you could also carry out a black breath attack, this kind of like the ultimate goth emo attack or of sorts, or I guess you could also say nihilistic. You basically take like all the negativity that you have within you and depression and such, and you can throw it out towards your enemies, and you feel great, and they become almost suicidal. Suicidal, perhaps, it depends on how well you do with that particular attack. Then we have the vitreous path. This is all about the direct manipulation of the energies of entropy. A lot of necromancers feel uncomfortable using this type of path, so you could, for example, sense health and the ultimate fate of any being. You could manipulate an aura of decay, so you could break down, for example, objects and machines. You could soul feast, that is, you could eat different specters and wraiths. They're actually like fruits, therefore your pleasure to take energy from them. Or you could unleash a deadly breath that makes a particular area like very attractive, or turn it into some sort of lure for specters. Or you could even cause great illness in your target. Your mastery of entropic knowledge could become so great that you could actually use the energies of entropy to empower that concept of entropy, or turn it down to the point that it actually becomes a positive effect. So, for example, you cause great entropy in someone, that being or target is going to become very weak, and his actions are not going to be very effective. But if you try to remove entropic energies around someone, that particular character is going to have a bonus in his checks. When it comes to necromantic rituals, they are all based in, I'm not sure if all of them, but a lot of them seem based around occult lore. That is some things that you could find in mythology and philosophy. And they're also quite complex. You need some very difficult to find ingredients, and at the same time they could be quite troublesome thematically. These are for mature groups and for people that do not lose their minds or become emotionally unstable when they see gruesome things in fiction. As I said at the beginning of this review, they usually take about a few minutes or perhaps even hours. It depends on the type of ritual that you're carrying out. And some of them will allow you to hear the whispers of the dead and the damned, and set some beacons to lure the different specters and rates towards different places. Some of them feel a bit like curses. They could give you some insight about the worlds of the dead and the living, and it also allows you to create some sort of amulets or talismans that allow you to constantly detect the presence of death, gain some abilities like augmented versions of aspects, that is perceiving aura and health and the state of death and the proximity of energies of entropy to someone. You even have some famous things, like for example you have the Hand of Glory, which is basically a tool of home invasion. And then you have sort of like puppets, or they look a bit like voodoo dolls that allow you to control or torture different beings, living, unliving, or spirits of the dead. You can carry out different rituals. You can even create some powerful weapons against wraiths and specters and such. However, a lot of these different talismans and ritual objects need living matter. You need to take a sacrificial victim and you remove like a bone or a piece of tissue, and the victim needs to be alive while you're carrying out this ritual. So it's a very gruesome and delicate process, but when it's actually done, and it usually results with the death of the target, of the victim, now you have a powerful, there's, I don't remember the name, I think it was the devil stick or the something stick something that allows you to attack spirits of the dead as if it were some sort of club. It was the Bastone Diabolico, devil stick. Yes, that's the one. There are also some rituals that allow you to empower other rituals, so they're kind of like enhancement. And you can also even, for example, remove the entire skin of someone, and that creature needs to be alive while the ritual is being carried out, and you can basically create a costume of that particular person, and you can act and disguise yourself as that target. You can also, of course, channel death energies to cause death in someone, but you could also take objects from beyond the shroud to bring them through the veil that separates the realm of the living and the dead. So necromancy is a very complex discipline, and all of its paths and rituals, they are not easy to figure out when it's appropriate to use them, but their effects could be chronicle changing. They could change the entire story or the chronicle itself. So what do I think of this couple of disciplines? Well, I think Fortitude is very much sought after. Every time that I have played Vampire the Masquerade, players are always looking to find a way of getting this discipline. And as a storyteller, I always made sure that they didn't do that, because I do not like when all of the disciplines are being shared with all of the characters. Maybe, I think I mentioned this in one part of the this multi-part review, that in the video game, one of the two computer games, you get to have a vampire with all of the disciplines, and that seems so unbalanced, and I feel like it takes away from the uniqueness of the different vampire clans. So Fortitude, everybody wants it because it allows you to survive for a longer time, but I think it's a lot more cool if you have, for example, the Gangrel and the Ravnos and the Ventru having Fortitude, that you feel like it's unique to them, because they are too these types of disciplines tend to become targets for power gamers. So suddenly you have a vampire marching with potence and fortitude and celerity and protean, and so you start to take away from the true essence of Vampire the Masquerade, of seeing this magnificent world of darkness, where you have to take those powers that you were born into through your acceptance into the different vampire clans, and try to make the most of it with what you are given, and perhaps maybe every now and then obtain some powers outside of your expected disciplines. And when it comes to necromancy, I think it's one of the best aspects of Vampire the Masquerade, but also one of the more difficult to apply. Because on the cool side of things, necromancy in Vampire the Masquerade is quite different from other role-playing games or storytelling games. When, for example, you would see Dungeons and Dragons, even in Ravenloft, you have some very gamey, or perhaps you could say tactical effects, more necromantic effects that have to do with causing damage and affecting the battleground or terrain, playing around with the powers that others can use against you, so it feels more like always about battle. But with the paths and rituals of Vampire the Masquerade when it comes to necromancy, you can play around with the game world with all of its subtle effects. Many of the necromantic effects, at least in the lower levels, feel a bit more like cantrips, to put it in a way. So they are subtle, they could feel a bit weak, but they are perfect when you are moving in society and messing around with your mortal rivals, or even with vampires that are not too knowledgeable in necromancy. I also like it quite a bit that in Vampire the Masquerade, spirits and wraiths and specters, they are not too easy to handle. It's not like, for example, in Dungeons and Dragons, again, you have your +1 sword or your sword of who knows what, or ghost touch and such, and once you get your hands on that particular item or weapon, you can fight against the wraiths and the specters. But here in Vampire the Masquerade, it's not easy to get your hands on such magical objects. And not all of the disciplines in Vampire the Masquerade feel that magical or that supernatural. A lot of them have to do with affecting the physical world. So necromancy is a very good, I guess you could say, bargaining token to use if you are the only vampire with the knowledge to affect those creatures, wraiths and ghosts and specters. Or if, for example, no one in your group or your coterie has that particular discipline, you will have to negotiate with those vampires that are privy to that knowledge. Now, when it comes to the rituals, they are quite disturbing. A lot of them include taking, for example, pieces of bone or tissue or fat from a living victim, a sacrificial victim, to carry out those rituals. They are quite gross and dark. So at times, I think it can reach levels similar to that seen in Carcosa, for example, although not so much, because in Carcosa a lot of rituals, dark rituals, involve sexual assault. So this is not something that will be accepted by some of, what would you say, faint-hearted groups. That is, even if you have only villains using these rituals, a lot of people may feel really uncomfortable with the necromancy rituals. However, I think a party of more civilized vampires could perhaps use those rituals, but having villains as the victims. So, for example, the methods of creating different like talismans and amulets, you could have like a really villainous victim, like someone who has done the worst of the worst, and you could have that character tortured during their ceremony, and but it's still going to be difficult for some groups. I think you will need to have the more mature and emotionally stable players carrying out those scenes, but it's still a very strong, perhaps extreme portrayal of the darkness of the world of Vampire the Masquerade, with a lot of opportunities to role-play the ritual or stop the ritual or carry out the ritual. The possibilities are pretty much endless, although that displays in all its dark splendor the mature and gut-wrenching nature of Vampire the Masquerade. Well, thanks for watching this part of my multi-part review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.